the chair of the science committee of the Dutch ADHD Association, and in daily life I work as a coach. I coach employees for employers. Tonight our guest is Barbara Franke. She will introduce herself in a minute. She works as professor at the Radboud University in the Netherlands. Viljo, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Viljo Wilding. I'm a board member of ADHD Europe, and Hans is second in command for broadcasting. So it will be me you're interacting with in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube, and it's my job to make sure everything goes smoothly. So fingers crossed it does.
Thank you, Viljo. Well, Barbara, can you introduce yourself a little?
Yes, yeah. So my name is Barbara Franke. I'm a professor of molecular psychiatry at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and also a PI at the Dondes Institute for Brain, Cognition and Behavior in Nijmegen. My specialty is the molecular analysis of ADHD and related psychiatric traits and disorders. And well, I hope today to tell you a little bit about my own view, where the field of ADHD is going in terms of the way in which we diagnose ADHD and the tools we use for diagnosis and determining prognosis of people with ADHD.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. Because the subject of today is the future of ADHD. It's not ADHD today, but what we can expect in the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years. Because until now, we have a limited possibility with questionnaires and subjective interviews, for instance, for diagnosis. And in my practice as a coach, I see a lot of people with a sort of serial diagnosis. They start with bipolar, and then they have ADHD, and then, well, no, it's not ADHD, it's autism. So we are expecting in the future that, for instance, biomarkers can help us. And Barbara, we hope that you can tell us at least a little about this complicated thing. And as your title, it will be about molecules today. So, okay, half of our public will be gone now. But I think you can make it more a sort of comprehensive for all of us.
I'm not going to talk only about molecules, and I hope that I can explain in a good way. And otherwise, please ask questions, and there will be time also for a little bit of discussion, as I understand, after the presentation.
Yeah, questions can be put in the comment line, and we will see them and answer them during today. Yeah.
Okay.
So go ahead. Maybe you can start your presentation.
Yeah. Let me start. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
You're all good to go.
Good. So the title that Hans gave me for this presentation is The Future of ADHD, and of course the future of ADHD is such a broad title that I had to find my own little niche in that. And I thought about talking about prospects of bringing biological findings into the clinical management of ADHD in the future. I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer here at the beginning. So what I'm going to tell is a little bit of recent research findings. And whenever I'm talking about those, I will give you references of where this can be read. Opinions about where, when we're talking about the future, where we're actually going are my own. So this is a little my disclaimer in talking about the future, which no one of us knows, of course.
Of course.
So let me start with something that all of you know, of course. ADHD is very common, both in children and in adults. And if we look at a study in children and adolescents from 2007 by Pulanchik and co-workers, they pulled together data on 102 studies across the world to look at the prevalence of ADHD in children and adolescents, and they found that the overall prevalence, taking everything together, was about a little bit higher than 5%. There were regional differences, some of them based on the fact that only few studies were available, but in general, 5% seems to be a measure for ADHD in children and adolescents. If you look at these groups separately, then ADHD is more common in children than it is in adolescents, as you can see here, and it is more common in boys than it is in girls. If you look at the situation in adults, also a very big study by Fayyad and co-workers in 2017, studies from 20 countries worldwide showed that the prevalence of ADHD in adults was about 2.8% on average, with a large spread, and the highest prevalence in high-income countries, which goes together very well with availability of diagnostic services. Treatment seeking for the adults was low across all countries, and most of the adults looked for treatment for other disorders, other conditions than actually ADHD, because as you know, adult ADHD is not yet well recognized in many countries. There are not many specialists that know how to diagnose and treat adult ADHD.
We are working on that from ADHD Europe perspective, of course, every day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So something else, of course, that you know, and that I'm using as an umbrella for some of the things that I'm going to talk about, is the symptom domains of ADHD. Hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inability to focus attention in a sustained and age-inappropriate way form the basis to make a diagnosis of ADHD. If we look at this type of behavior, these type of symptoms, then actually what we find is that across the population, so everybody in a population, there is a distribution of ADHD symptoms. So most of us show some of the symptoms that are used in the diagnosis of ADHD every day or once in a while. But a number of people has these ADHD symptoms in an impairing and clinically relevant way. And at a certain point where the impairment starts, people have put the threshold for the diagnosis of ADHD. So in addition to the symptoms that are the basis of ADHD diagnosis, it is very important that impairment from these symptoms actually is taken into account in making the diagnosis. As Hans already said, the diagnosis of ADHD, as it is for other psychiatric conditions, is made based on clinical interviews and questionnaires. And although the clinical interviews are standardized interviews, structured interviews, and also the questionnaires are well validated, there is an air of subjectivity and doubt if you cannot have an objective test, a more objective test that actually shows you in a sort of, for example, based on a biological measure, that there is ADHD or there is other psychiatric condition. So actually looking into psychiatry more broadly, it is clear that psychiatry is the last specialty in medicine that bases its diagnosis exclusively on interviews and on questionnaires. And there is no biomarker across psychiatry yet. So why is that so difficult? Why is it so difficult to develop such biomarkers in psychiatry? If we look at other fields of medicine, blood markers, for example, are frequently used for diagnostic purposes. And in neurology, for example, people base diagnosis on pictures of the brain, here and magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. So what about ADHD in terms of biomarker, of blood markers, and in terms of imaging markers? And I'm going to start with the imaging and show you some of the work that has been done in recent years and what we come across. So a lot of the research on biomarkers based on neuroimaging are based on magnetic resonance imaging, so MRI of the brain. And many studies have been done in this field, but MRI is relatively costly. So many of the studies have included relatively small numbers of people with ADHD and without ADHD. And what has been observed in the findings from these studies is that often they are not comparable between different studies. So one study cannot reproduce the findings that another study had. And that is because the sample size is so small. And in addition, the effects that we see in the brain of people with ADHD are relatively small. So if you have few people and you have very small effects, that's asking for problems if you're looking at reproducibility across studies.
Because reproducibility is a very important thing also for people who are not into science. If you read one research findings, always wait for it to be reproduced, because then it is more generally valid. Do I understand that right?
Yes, absolutely. So if I cannot replicate the findings of somebody of an earlier study, this means that the findings are not robust enough to show up again. So they are small and maybe specific to the group that was studied in this first study, and not relevant for all people with ADHD, for example.
Yeah.
So what we tried to do actually was to rather than look into individual studies, bring all the researchers together that had done studies based on MRI of ADHD. And we did that in the context of the Enigma Consortium, which is a very large international consortium that brings together research on brain MRI and behavior. And Martine Hoogman leads the Enigma working group on ADHD. And actually, she succeeded in bringing together researchers with 36 cohorts of people with ADHD and without ADHD. And in total, she had data on 2,350 people with ADHD and over 2,000 without ADHD. So these are numbers that enable us to more robustly identify differences between people with ADHD and without ADHD in the brain. And to summarize what Martine found, first of all, she found that indeed several regions in the brain are slightly smaller in people with ADHD on average, and I've marked here on average, and I will come back to that in a minute. When she looked across the lifespan, she found that these differences that we see between people with and without ADHD are actually most pronounced in the youngest children that we had in the study. But still, even in these young children, the differences between those with ADHD and without ADHD are small. And then, interestingly, these differences are not only seen when you compare people with ADHD and without ADHD, but also if you look into the general population and you compare those with few ADHD symptoms and those with more ADHD symptoms, you see that the regions that are smaller in the children with ADHD also differ in people without ADHD, depending on the number of ADHD symptoms that they show. So that's quite interesting. So this is not a strong difference between those that have ADHD diagnosis and those that don't, but it's a gradual difference between depending on the number of ADHD symptoms somebody has. So this is in summary the things that we found in the brain of people with ADHD using MRI. And I want to go into one thing a little bit deeper, and this is this first point are slightly smaller in people with ADHD on average, because to have a biomarker we would have to have the fact that the regions show the same effect in all people with ADHD. But what actually a PhD student, Ting Li, in my lab found was that there are subgroups among people with ADHD and also among people without ADHD, where the findings actually are opposite. So take, for example, the region here, which is called the limbic system. In this subgroup of the population, people with ADHD have actually larger limbic system, whereas here in this subgroup, they have smaller limbic system. Whereas in this subgroup 1 and subgroup 2, they are not different from people without ADHD. So there's a lot of differences between people with ADHD, and these differences between people with ADHD are actually larger than the differences between people with ADHD and those without ADHD. So not everyone has the same brain alterations, and in general, the brain alterations in people with ADHD are very small.
So based on these outcomes, you can't turn it around, like put one child of 10 years old under the MRI scanner, and we see this brain area is a bit smaller or is a bit larger, and now we know you have ADHD or you don't. That's
Exactly.
not possible yet.
Yeah. So actually, Yan Li, Zhang James, working with Steve Ferrone in the United States, she put this question, exactly this question, to the test. So she used the data from Enigma ADHD, and she asked the question, can I predict from these data whether a person has ADHD? And this is what you see here. So it's quite a difficult picture, but what I want to show you here is this is a chance level. So if you want to predict something, you have to be on that side of chance level. Chance level means just throwing a coin and saying, okay, if it's heads, this person has ADHD. If it's not, then this person doesn't have ADHD. So that doesn't make sense, right? If we want to predict, we have to have accuracy. And what we see here is that that she can indeed, when she takes data from the brains of adult people with ADHD, and she tries to predict ADHD in adults, she finds an accuracy of about 60 to 65%, and the same is true for children with ADHD. So there is some information, and we're doing clearly better than chance level here in these analyses, but an prediction accuracy of 60 to 65% is just too low for a diagnostic test. So it's a nice that we're going in the right direction, and machine learning is really the newest methods that we can use for the analysis of such data. But still, the effects, the differences between people with ADHD and without ADHD are too small to be used to really make a diagnosis based on neuroimaging. In addition to this fact that we have so small effects, neuroimaging based on MRI at least is also quite expensive. So my own prediction, as you may say, and my own opinion is that it is unlikely that we're going to use MRI for ADHD diagnostics in the coming years. So we're not going to put people in the scanner, and based on that, we'll be able to make a diagnosis of ADHD. So that's imaging and making pictures of the brain. What about the blood biomarkers then? What about those? Can we use them? What's the
sorry, what? Yeah, before you go on to another, someone from the public is asking, do you think that in the future it would be easier to rely on MRI scans if more studies are done? If yes, in your opinion, what would be a time frame for this to happen? Okay, name an exact year. But is it a question of we need more study, or is it more or less, as we, at the moment, we don't see anything, so we won't see anything in the future, or is there development in the MRI scans, only the MRI scans?
There is clearly developments. We need more data. We need even larger samples to say more. But given this subgroups in the data, and I just showed you one study there, but there are studies that show that this the differences between people with ADHD are even larger than what I've just showed you. I think it will be quite a long time before we can actually use such pictures based on MRI in ADHD diagnostics. What may be possible is that at a certain point we use, for example, a blood test in combination with an MRI picture, and in that way create enough information to make a diagnosis. But I would think that also based on the costs, this is not yet likely. There are more likely scenarios, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And I hope to show you some of them now. Okay, so blood markers. What about those? Let's have a look. One of the things that we can see from analyses in blood is the genetic material. And the genetic material for ADHD is quite a good place to start if you're looking for biomarkers, because like other psychiatric conditions, ADHD is highly heritable. And what you see here are data from twin studies in which people have looked at monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins and have looked at the differences, knowing that monozygotic twins are actually, and that is identical twins, are actually identical in terms of their genetic material, whereas dizygotic twins are actually like brother and sister and share only about 50% of their genetic material. So based on the differences between these two groups, people have estimated the contribution of genetics to ADHD, and they find that ADHD has a heritability of about 74%. And that's similar to autism, to schizophrenia, and also bipolar disorder. So quite high heritability. And this high heritability, if you look at it, is again meaning that on average, in the average patient, which of course doesn't exist, 70% of the symptoms can be explained based on genetic factors. So that's quite a good place to start. But then what does it mean? Let me unpack that for you a little bit. When we're talking about heritability of diseases in humans, we generally have the idea that there is a genetic defect, what we also call a mutation, and that if this genetic defect is present, also also the disease or a disorder is present. In these cases, actually genetic testing is offered. However, in ADHD, this is not the model. What we see in ADHD is that in at least most persons with ADHD, it's not one genetic defect, but rather there are a number or even multiple genetic variants present, and I'm not calling them defects because they are present in everybody essentially, or can be present in everybody. And each of these genetic variants has only a very small effect in increasing the risk to develop ADHD. So not a single genetic defect that we can easily link to a disease. In ADHD, we're talking about several to multiple genetic variants, and each of them has only a very small effect on disease risk.
Yeah, there were 2 questions already from the public that all this tends to, there are several types of ADHD and several courses. You will come to that, I know, but this multiple genetic, if you have those 50 genetic variants or you have the other 30 variants, then you will be a different type of ADHD at least. So I think you will come to that.
I will come to that. Yeah. Okay, so again, what does that mean? Let me try to show you a little bit. So genes contribute to the functioning of our brain, and they do so through biological processes. And here, what I'm trying to depict such a biological process. And one of these biological processes, for example, is that in the development of the brain, before birth and after birth, brain cells have to form very long extensions, and they reach out to other brain cells in other parts of the brain, and they make connections with these other brain cells. And these connections are very important in the communication of different cells in our brain. They are very important in sensing the environment and reacting to the environment. So in that way, they are essential, and is the machine, and they are the machinery that is important for our behavior. So one of these biological processes then is indeed the outgrowth, the forming of these extensions. And these biological processes are based on the function, of genes. So each of these little squares here is a gene. In some of these genes, genetic variants are present. And these genetic variants can make that the biological process that this gene contributes to actually functions a little bit less optimal than it would be if this genetic variant wasn't present. Many of us have some of these genetic variants in a biological process. So nothing is wrong. Everything can still, this biological process can still work very well. But if there are many of these genetic variants in such a biological process, then sometimes things go not so optimal anymore. And what then can happen to this process of outgrowth of these brain cells is that some of the cells actually may form extensions that are too short to reach the other cell, or that the growth actually happens too slow, and they are not at the right place at the right time in development, which can be crucial. Or actually, some of the brain cells may not walk directly towards their target cell, but rather take take a different route and make and not connect optimally with their target. So our brain, luckily, is very flexible, and it can compensate for such alterations in the development. But in many cases, then the communication between the brain cells that depends on these connections to be made in daily life will be a little bit less optimal. And due to this a little bit less optimal process of communication, we may be less well able to adapt our behavior to the needs of a specific situation. And this can cause symptoms of a psychiatric disorder, for example. Hans, do you think that this is do you understand what I'm saying here? I'm using you as a
of course. I'm your fool for the fool to make it fool's proof. So I will keep on asking foolish questions. But the main interest is: are there any objective biomarkers via which we can diagnose and treat people with ADHD and predict certain things? So that's very clear. Then, of course, all these genetic variants. I have a bit of a problem with which was on your sheet, your dia here before, about optimal. Yeah, here you say it's no, it's one before. It says.
Yeah, I think this one.
Too slow, less optimal. Can you explain that really biologically that something is wrong there, or is it only circumstantial, depending on the environment? What makes you conclude that it is, okay, this cell, this molecule doesn't operate optimal? How do you know that?
Yeah, so we can measure, for example, the activity of certain genes or products of genes. And what we see when some of these genetic variants are present is that they actually are altered in their activity. And that makes that indeed this biological process will not be running as smoothly, let's say, as it would be if this genetic variant is not present. That is what I mean with less optimal. And if you have many of these genetic variants in a certain biological process, this biological process will not essentially be optimal in terms of making sure that all brain cells make the connections that they should make. That is clear. And in most cases, and probably in most environments also, this is not a problem for the brain to function. But if we are, for example, stressed, or if we are put into a certain situation where we have to show a certain behavior, we may not be able to show this behavior in all cases.
Yeah, so it depends on in which environment you place this person with certain disconnections. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for explaining. Yeah.
So going back to this figure that I showed you before, if we put the genetics in there, then what we see is that those people that have few symptoms of ADHD also have a small number of genetic risk variants for ADHD. And thank you. I showed that here. But those that have a large number of ADHD symptoms actually have a higher number of these genetic risk variants for ADHD. So then, can we use that? So the question is then, of course, can we use that as a diagnostic biomarker? can we identify the genetic variants that play a role in ADHD and use them as a biomarker in ADHD diagnostics through genetic testing? That's now the question that I want to go into. So let's have a look. Can we identify the genetic variants that play a role in ADHD? Yes, we can. And this is a large study that came out in 2019, which actually identified the first genetic variants for ADHD. And what we needed for that was to collect data from over 20,000 people with ADHD and 35,000 people without ADHD. And then a whole array of genetic variants was analyzed across the entire genetic material of each of these persons. And what you see here is actually the result. And it's just, don't look too much at it. It's just a fancy way of showing results. What you see here on the x-axis down here is the different chromosomes that somebody has. And then these green towers actually show the places where there is a genetic variant that is linked to ADHD, that increases the risk for ADHD. And actually this study in over 20,000 people with ADHD identified 12 regions where there is a genetic risk variant for ADHD present on our genome. And these were the first 12.
What is a region?
Just a region, so just a physical location on the genome, a place.
A place. Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole genome. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're putting the information that we have from genetic variants that are relevant for ADHD together, and we're trying to extract from that the biological processes that are involved in ADHD, we do find indeed this process that I already showed you. So this forming extensions of the brain cells to connect to each other. That's an important process that seems to be somewhat altered in ADHD. Synapse formation is the actual forming of contacts between the different brain cells, and also there are genetic variants present that seem to be important for ADHD. And then synaptic plasticity is actually the real functioning of the connections between the different brain cells in the communication between the different brain cells. And also here we find differences between people with ADHD and people without ADHD. However, this is only the tip of the iceberg, and many more of these biological processes are to be identified. And moreover, not every of these biological processes will be equally important for every person with ADHD. So we showed subgroups in the imaging data, and there will likely also be subgroups in the genetic data. So for some people, it may be really an effect of this neurite outgrowth that is most relevant for their ADHD, and in some people it may be this synaptic plasticity that is more involved. Another question that comes up when looking at these genetic data is actually how specific they are for ADHD. So is a genetic risk variant really only involved in ADHD, or does it also have relevance for other psychiatric disorders like autism or bipolar disorder? And what you see here is a correlation plot, and again it's a fancy way of showing the data, but what the message here is that the genetic variants for ADHD actually overlap with those for anorexia nervosa, for autism spectrum disorders, for bipolar disorder, for major depressive disorder, for schizophrenia and Tourette syndrome. So there is a lot of overlap in the genetic variants across different diagnoses actually. which is interesting and which could also help us to diagnose comorbidities, so things that occur together in an individual.
The connectivity problems that you have explained to us now make me think of autism, where there is also, but I think, another connectivity problem, and that might also explain why there's a lot of confusion. Has this person ADHD, or is it autism, or does he have both? Can you shortly mention the difference between connectivity in autism and connectivity in ADHD? Is that clear, or is it fuzzy?
It is far from clear. Okay. It may be the same. It may be certain regions that are regions of the brain that are more important for autism than for ADHD, and the other way around. We see differences in the brain studies. We see differences between ADHD and autism spectrum disorders in the regions that are altered in these two disorders. So essentially, connectivity could play a role in both ADHD and autism, but it could be in different parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And this is really a puzzle that we still have to put together. So how do the genetic findings match with the imaging findings, for example?
And how can we differentiate between all these?
Yeah. Well, there is not only overlap in the genetic findings for the different psychiatric categories, psychiatric diagnoses, but there's also genetic sharing or genetic overlap with other types of human diseases. And I want to point out here the overlap, for example, with obesity. So part of the genetic variants that are involved in ADHD actually also play a role in obesity and in weight gain. So that's quite interesting and could also help us in the future in making more specific diagnosis and potentially indicate whether a person that is diagnosed with ADHD actually also runs the risk of overweight and obesity. And a postdoc in my group did research to identify the genetic variants that actually are involved in both ADHD and in obesity. And she finds that dopamine signaling, so one of the neurotransmitters, one of the communication agents, communication substances, is actually very important in this overlap, in this genetic overlap. So dopamine seems to play a role in both ADHD and in obesity, which is interesting and could help us actually in the treatment and also in the diagnosis. So based on that, we already seem to know quite a lot about the genetics, but can we use it in the diagnosis of people with ADHD and potentially co-occurring problems? And here I put a very large no, because we know a little bit, but we need many more studies and we need much larger numbers of participants. And I showed you that we identified the 12 places on the genome where there is an ADHD risk genetic variant present, but we're expecting that there will be at least 1,000 of these places. So really, before we have identified a number of those, it's much too early to use these results in diagnostic testing. Nevertheless, this actually is my dream of helping to actually make this happen in the future, and that we can in the end use these genetic findings or things that are related to them in terms of blood biomarkers for identifying people with ADHD and then just not identifying people with ADHD, but rather the specific biological processes that are most relevant for an individual person with ADHD. And based on that, try to find the best therapeutic option for this person, predict the prognosis. So knowing, for example, that there is genetic variants for both ADHD and obesity, does this person run the risk of also getting overweight in the future? Predicting prognosis in terms of the persistence of ADHD from childhood to adulthood. I think that really is what drives me in going further in this direction.
I think in this stage it's important about genetic predisposition, like in the predestination way, because you're talking about ADHD, and in what I think of it, it's you are born with ADHD and that's it, and your environment can help you to develop. And would like to know what you think of that. And the same for obesity. If you say there is a risk of obesity, it's maybe important to say that you don't have to get obesity.
Yeah, exactly.
So can you? I'm a bit confused about that. So can you explain?
So the word here is risk. People are at increased risk, but that doesn't mean because of their genetic makeup. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily really develop ADHD or develop obesity. That depends also on their environment, for example. So it's not like we shouldn't see genetics as deterministic in terms of ADHD or any other disorder that we're talking about. You get an increased risk. You can get that from your genetics. You can get that from air pollution. You can get that from problems in pregnancy or during birth. So it doesn't have to be genetics, and genetics doesn't have to say that you're actually getting the disorder. We shouldn't be deterministic.
The disorder, like in the behavioral markers, the behavioral problems, or the problems with your environment at work or in school or whatever.
Yeah.
And the same problems can occur from children who have had problems when they were still in the uterus, in the womb, and but then it's not the genetic variant of ADHD.
No.
Or, oh, okay. So in the end, here we come back to subtypes. In the end, there will be subtypes that maybe even will be named different.
Yeah, I would think that what we clearly see is that the whole psychiatric naming, all the psychiatric diagnoses really are not based on biology. There is a lot of overlap between the different diagnoses that we have at whichever level we look, in imaging, in genetics. So we find that these diagnoses essentially help in a certain way to give things a name and also to treat people, but they don't necessarily reflect the underlying biology, the underlying biological processes that are altered in the person that has such a diagnosis. That's very important. And in that way, I think that in the coming 10 to 20 years, we will see a major shift in psychiatry based on a better biological understanding of what is actually happening in people that have these psychiatric diagnoses. And based on that, we hopefully can make better subgroups that we can, for example, help in the same way with the same therapeutic options.
Yeah. So sometimes I compare it with fever. When you go to your GP fever, and then the GP looks very intelligent. Yes, I think you have a high temperature fever. That's about what we say about ADHD. We only see the symptoms, but we don't know if it's malaria or just a cold or it's COVID or whatever. So, that's why I say we may expect, we don't know for sure, but in the future, the subtypes of ADHD will be named different based on biological biomarkers or whatever.
Yeah.
That is rational, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And whether we can then call it still ADHD is another question.
We're talking about the future today.
Yeah, we're talking about the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is indeed, this is my hope for the future, and something that I expect to happen at a certain point. And we're not talking next year, we're talking probably 15, 20 years from now. So what I showed you is that I'm putting question marks to the imaging, and especially the MRI, based on the evidence that we have now. I think that there is promise in the blood-based biomarkers, but there is more ongoing at the moment. And this has to do with digital phenotyping. And I want to go back to this slide for a moment, remind you about the symptoms that we're looking at, and then saying that actually these symptoms or these behaviors can potentially be captured by, for example, smartphones, or by wearables like the things that we all have to count our steps, or to look at our heart rate, etc., etc. In that way, we're not necessarily looking at the biological mechanisms that underlie ADHD, but we potentially will be able to have more objective measurements. Importantly, we will have more continuous measurements, meaning that you don't have, when the diagnosis is made, you're asked about to look at quite a number of months or years back and answer whether these symptoms were always there. And you have to remember that, whether that was actually the case. But instead, you could also measure it. Using these wearables, you can measure them. And we can measure multiple different domains of behavior, social behavior, the activity that we see, the impulsivity that we see, etc. So I think that is really something that is currently ongoing. We see these digital biomarkers already coming in other areas of psychiatry, and I think that is also a development that will find its way into the diagnosis and the management of ADHD within the coming 10 years. There are several groups that are working on that already, so this is definitely coming, and the first products are already on the market for that. So this is my story on my take on the future of ADHD, and with that I would like to end, and of course I'm open for questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so far. And there did indeed come in some questions from the public, and I've prepared some other questions also. So, let's start with the last picture you showed about the wearables and the sensors. In the Netherlands, we have been trying to set up a monitor for side effects of medication. That's the same idea, that when via wearables you can measure your heart rhythm, etc. So I think it's very inspiring that you also work on that. There are some people have problems. In fact, many people have problems with heart rhythm problems, etc., from methylphenidate or dexamphetamine. most of them are very happy with it, but that would help us with ADHD to monitor ourselves and take initiative to go to the doctor if we see something on our monitor, on our sensors. So on that end, it works the same, but you are more into what exactly do you think will be measurable via wearables and sensors, etc.?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. What are the relevant things that we can measure? I think we can definitely measure hyperactivity or activity, increased motility of a person, for example. In terms of the possibility to sustain attention and inattention on the other side, it's more difficult. How do you measure that in a valid way? And that is actually the questions that are now being asked. So how can we measure that? Can we, for example, use smartphones and send people messages at a certain point and with short questions? Would that be a way of monitoring how attentive they are to a certain thing they are doing at that point? For example, are there other ways to look at attention and inattention?
Yeah.
Impulsivity is another one of the domains. So how do we measure that best? But there are so many ways in which these data from smartphones can be used. People are working on ways to use the words that are being said in an anonymous way, of course, because you have to take into account that people have to have privacy, right? But you can do that with machines trying to analyze the number of negative words. Let's say something, or how many different people somebody is calling. Things like that can be measured. Well, taking into account the privacy of a person still. And that is something that is currently being looked at. Can heart rate help us? Can we do something with headbands? Is it informative how somebody sleeps? The sleep quality or the length of the sleep? Is that informative for making a diagnosis or for monitoring individuals, or perhaps for how they should, which therapeutic options one should use?
Yeah, well, I definitely think that that's the future, and that there was another question about have someone already started to work on wearables or apps for ADHD? There are some apps for ADHD, but that's not what we are talking about. I know in Israel there's a person working with what you say, measuring the hyperactivity, even to get a diagnosis and to also monitor the way the medication works. But do you know of anybody on the world that's already experimenting with real people with it?
Sure, yeah. So there's groups in Brazil, for example. There's groups in the UK that are looking into that. There's groups in Germany. So there's a lot of activity. We're writing grants to do that ourselves. In the Netherlands, there is already ADHD or ADHD, not ADHD Europe, but Impulse and Woordblind, the Dutch patient organizations are involved in these efforts. So there is a lot of activity in this direction, definitely.
Okay, great. I can imagine that the gadget freaks are volunteering now to participate. There was, in fact, a question: is it possible to volunteer for participation in genetic studies or in studies like this with these gadgets? Can one volunteer for that? How does one become a volunteer in a study, in research?
It depends on the country where you live. So the different groups are doing data collection at a different time, let's say. So I think that many of these groups will advertise advertise their studies through patient organizations. At least that is what we always do. So that may be a good place to start looking for a study that is in your area, and may be open and collecting data.
Yeah. Okay.
We hope at a certain point to do this on a very large scale, together with an international consortium, the Impact Consortium. We have been working towards a collective data collection. But in terms of genetic data, there's a lot about privacy as well. So ethics is very strict. Until now, we're not allowed to do that in a European way. So every country essentially has to get their own ethics approval, and for individual studies. So it's still not so strongly organized and European organized as I would like to have it.
Yeah.
Another area that we're working on.
Yeah. Well, for the public who is interested in participating in studies, I know that if you become a member of your national association, you will be invited, because I know from the UK, Netherlands, other countries, these national associations, they get invited by universities, and then they ask their members, hey, can you participate in study about obesity or depression or use wearables? So become a member of your national association does help in this way. And then you can help being a volunteer and having an interesting experience. Another question was, how about the genetics and the predisposition for methylphenidate or DEX or other medication? Is there any hope for the future that in the future, yes, in 50 years, but for the nearer future, because there's a lot of trouble people finding the right medication. You know, some are methylphenidate, hit, go, ready, but many have a sort of quest, a search for 2-3 years until they, in the end, find the 5th medication, demotivated, etc. So it's a relevant question.
Yeah, it is, and there is research on that, but until now, not very successful in finding a biomarker that predicts which medication would be fitting best, unfortunately. So that will take more years.
So the same as on other issues, we know already some or a lot about it, but not enough to ask your doctor, hey, give me that test, and then we know dexamfetamine or bupropion or whatever ADHD medication. No, that's in the future. It may be possible.
Yeah.
Potentially. Nice word. Yes. Okay. There was a question about, you were talking about genetics, and most people know, in the meanwhile, epigenetics. So the influence of environment on genetics. Maybe you should shortly explain what epigenetics is, and if there's any news on that part of the research.
Yeah, so genetics is essentially is our hardware. It is the code that determines the biological processes in our body. So the hardware, genes are produce proteins, and these proteins are important for fulfilling the tasks, for fulfilling the biological processes in our body. This hardware needs to be specified in some way to be able to function differently in different cells. The genetic code is the same in all of our cells, but to be able to have different functions in different cells, we need more information. And this is what epigenetics actually does. And epigenetics is a modification of the genetic material that determines whether genes can become active or will not become active. And the epigenetics is partly determined by genetic information itself, but partly also by environmental information. So that's the nice thing about studying epigenetics. And indeed, people have started looking into the role of epigenetic markers in ADHD. This research is less far than the genetic research is, and there is still a lot of the things that we always see in a new field of research, where there is too small studies to find reproducible results. Here we go again, in the presence of relatively small effects. So that is also the case for epigenetics. It's not the magic bullet, but it is an interesting way of combining the genetic hardware and some information about the environment in one, and potentially that may also help us in terms of developing blood markers in the future.
Yeah. Here is your answer has the same pattern. We already know a lot, but we don't have the one bullet. And you mentioned shortly the machine learning and artificial intelligence. And do you see any future in artificial intelligence using all that we know, and that will develop, of course? And because as one psychiatrist can do only one thing at a time, but if you put on machine learning, a computer can calculate much faster than we can. Do you see any future in that with all these data we already have or will obtain still?
There's absolutely a future in machine learning. Machine learning is the basis for many of the tests that are being developed now. Machine learning is a little bit of a, well, it's a very high level analysis of not high level, advanced method of data analysis. And it essentially it looks for patterns in data, and that is what we're searching for, right? We're trying to find the data, and it's smarter than our own brain, because at a certain point we cannot process all the information, and that is where machine learning can help us. The thing is that machine learning depends on data, and I agree with you, Hans, that putting all this together, genetics, brain imaging, epigenetics, what have you, that would be wonderful. But then we have to have these data, all these data, genetics, imaging, epigenetics, in the same persons, and across thousands of people. Yeah. So that requires a lot of data collection, requires a lot of money.
A lot of money, yes. I was thinking about that. Well. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what I see, I think the developments that are now ongoing in many of the patient groups to organize themselves and to take the lead in research, I think that is the right development, and that we have to make use of this development and use, for example, these digital markers for people to collect over a long period of time their information about how many steps they make in a day, what their heart rate is, how they sleep, etc., and then spit into a pot and send it somewhere for genetic analysis. Yeah. That I hope is what we can achieve. But then again, the ethical hurdles that we have to jump to set something like that up, and to find the funding on a large scale to do that. That is what holds this back, essentially.
But you have your connections with ADHD Europe and all the national associations. So at least we're gonna help you scientists with this.
And that is very important. That this is more than we've done before. That we really work together in this.
Yeah.
Because you have the relevant question, and we can try to do the analyses to answer those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make a turn to the neurodevelopmental side, because we call ADHD Europe ADHD a neurodevelopmental problem, difference, if you want a disorder. Some want that. One question was about late maturization of the brain. I think I've been reading about that, but can you explain, is that known in science that an ADHD brain, a typical ADHD brain, shows a late maturization? What is maturization? And
that is something that has been postulated, and that we've also argued about in the papers from Martine Hoofman that I showed shortly. So what we see is indeed that the brain, the differences between people with ADHD and without ADHD are strongest when children are very young, in young children.
Yeah.
And then the level, what we can see is that these differences normalize. So in adulthood, although people still have ADHD, their brains do not look different from those that don't have ADHD. So that has been interpreted as a later maturation of the brain, and with the way we can certainly currently look, which is through the MRI, this is the level. Well, this interpretation is correct.
Okay.
If we had more invasive ways of looking at the brain, or looking at the brain in larger resolution, this may have to be altered. But for now, it looks like some processes, at least, are occurring somewhat later in those with ADHD than in those without ADHD. On average, yeah. Again, on average.
On average, yeah. We understand that on average, not yet predictable. Sure. I was asking it because sometimes I think, well, I would like you to elaborate a bit about the neurotransmitters, because you were talking about connectivity and the size of certain brain areas. Okay, that's science now. We know a lot about that already, but we do know that dopamine and noradrenaline play an important role in ADHD. So how's the connection between neurotransmitters and the developing brain?
Well, there are several. First of all, neurotransmitters are also important in guiding this outgrowth that I showed you, the extensions, informing the extensions in the developing brain. That's one. Then indeed, the neurotransmitters are very important in the communication of the brain cells with each other. They are the basis of communication between brain cells. So in that way, they are also important in the day-to-day functioning of our brain. And there are certain neurotransmitters that we know to be important. Well, dopamine and noradrenaline are two on which medication is based. The recent genetic studies also seem to point to a role of GABA, which is another neurotransmitter. So we're starting to find information in the genetic studies and in the biological studies that point us to the different neurotransmitters as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
Great.
showed you the information about this overlap or genetic sharing between ADHD and obesity, where indeed also dopamine seems to play a very important role. So that's also interesting then.
Sure. Yeah, I think altogether, let me at least say before we are going to round up and look at final questions, that everything you tell is very important in the anti-stigma movement. There is a lot of resistance in certain European countries as well against ADHD, and sometimes I can understand it because ADHD, in a way, it's a bit vague and only behavioral, and it's not really on or off, So when we will have clear physiological biomarkers, that would really make us happy for certain countries at least. Even in the Netherlands, there is, as you know, a lot of discussion in certain groups. So do you think that in a way you can contribute to stigma like I'm suggesting? Anti-stigma.
I hope so. I'm trying. I'm doing really my best, and with my group to try to bring this information to people. But it also has two sides, right? And you already alluded to this deterministic thinking about genetics. So and the same goes for the brain findings. So what I hope really that by finding these biological or increasing the biological understanding about ADHD, we can reduce stigma. But on the other hand, it may also contribute to stigma if we say that somebody has a different brain, and if somebody has a delayed brain maturation. So that's not what we want. But sometimes things are being turned on their head and we can't do anything about it.
No, of course. Well, there was a question about, you've been talking about the brain areas, the connectivity, and now we had the neurotransmitters, and there's one still hidden factor, that's the electricity in the brain. Mm-hmm. And today I found one research study about abnormal patterns in electrical oscillatory activity has been repeatedly described in adult ADHD, and the alpha rhythm, whatever that may be, known to be modulated during attention, has previously been considered as candidate biomarker in ADHD. And there were people in public asking for the EEG scans. Can you share a little about that?
Yeah, so I've been talking about MRI as a way of analyzing our brain and making things visible in the brain. MRI is very good when it comes to locations in the brain. It can tell us relatively well where in the brain things are happening. Another way of looking into the brain, is EEG indeed. And in EEG, we're trying to make visible the communication between brain cells, which you can measure based on electricity, electric currents. And these are, for example, with all these things that are being put on your head, we can measure these activities in the brain. And indeed, people have worked on that for ADHD as well, and found that there are differences. But then again, it is the same thing as it is with, and now my camera is off, is that correct?
Yeah, your camera is off, yeah. Please put it on again. Yeah, okay, there, yeah.
It is the same thing as with MRI, with genetics. Studies are relatively small, and findings are not the same across studies. So indeed, it says repeatedly shown, but there are 5 other studies perhaps that have not shown it. So it's very difficult to find things that are robust enough. And what you're saying about the subtypes in ADHD is actually what I think is really here. ADHD is not one entity. It is a number of things. And there are many ways to go to Rome. There's probably many ways to get ADHD. And in that way, we have to take that into account when we think about biomarkers for ADHD.
Yeah, well, that's a nice pathway to the future. We can connect because we all feel in all these associations, we feel connected on the symptom like fever called ADHD. But in fact, we are quite different, maybe totally different, because and when you look at the causes of it or the subtypes which are mentioned, yes, sure. Now we are into EEG. There was a question about neurofeedback. We've been digging into neurofeedback a lot, and we have seen some results. What do you think of the neurofeedback as a helpful means to help you with your ADHD?
Hans, we're getting into an area where I'm not an expert and where essentially
okay.
I can't say anything that would be helpful.
No, the question is, of course, understandable, because it's also, they do something with your brain, at least they pretend that you do something with your brain. And well, I know the latest research says it helps like the medication. At the moment, it helps a little and less than medication, but it helps a little for the days that you do neurofeedback. But it doesn't cure your ADHD. So you do 10 weeks neurofeedback and then your ADHD is gone. Not. So you have to, but I didn't know that it's not your area and we are going out of there.
The only thing that I can say is indeed, well, what they're trying with the neurofeedback is essentially to make you try to manipulate your brain, try to activate your brain in certain regions. And in regions that they think are less active at certain points than they should be. That is what neurofeedback does. But then again, with the differences between people in terms of the areas that may be most relevant for their ADHD, it may be that you have to direct this to a more specified group. And it may help some people with ADHD and not others.
Yeah, again, yeah. That's what we may expect. Okay, I think that we have had quite some questions already and time to round up. Viljo, anything I forgot to ask? I think I have been able to...
No. I'd just like to echo the fact that if you join your national association, you'll have a lot of opportunities to get involved in research. I know that through ADIS, we've had some people who are interested in getting involved in the ARC Karma study, which is to do with wearable technology. That's run by King's in the UK. I think Barbara might be familiar. It's part of the Timespan project. And that's one of the new EU-funded projects that just started off on the 1st of April this year. So it should be exciting, and your organizations will give you opportunities to get involved in these sorts of things. So it's well worth joining.
Yeah.
Sure.
So ARC Karma is indeed one of these projects that looks into the digital phenotyping and the role of digital phenotyping. So yeah. Yep.
Well, then I would like to round up with thanking you very much for your clear explanation. And what I like is that I feel and I know and I notice that you understand the cooperation between us, let's say the owners of ADHD. We own our genetic structure, whatever it will be. And you are our provider for science, like our psychiatrist is our provider for psychiatry and medication. So thank you very much. Now you
just lost.
Here
we go. Oh, no. we've just lost Barbara.
Getting lost. My camera stopped.
Yeah,
I can't
we've
get
lost your camera. That's okay. That brings the stream nicely to a close, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. So, Barbara, thank you very much on behalf of ADHD Europe and all the other associations in all the European states.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, for inviting me. I hope I was a little bit clear. I'm always open for questions. I enjoy very much in working with ADHD Europe as one of your professional board. Happy to do that, and yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye bye. Thank you.